Good morning. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. My name is Lene Erickson. I'm a senior vice president at Third Way. And like probably many people in this room, I read what feels like about 100 polls a day at this point, trying to understand what Americans outside the DC bubble are thinking and feeling and how they're feeling about the world. I dig through crosstabs and look at different demographics to try to understand differences based on things like age or geography or gender. And many times I will find myself looking at the one crosstab that contains Black Americans. It's one line, and at best it has, maybe 100 people in it. And then we use it to make broad generalizations about what Black Americans think of every geography, of every experience. And sometimes it's even worse than that. Sometimes it's just a crosstab for people of color, which is an even broader category. And sometimes people of color are entirely erased because the sample size is so small that you can't say anything about them at all. We think that that is not sufficient or acceptable, and so we have been working for the past few months at Third Way with the Joint Center on Political and Economic Studies to really dig into, in a multi-round research project, what do Black Americans think as we go into 2020? And we did larger sample sizes so that we could understand what we know is true. Just like white Americans, they may have different experiences, views, attitudes, based on a whole variety of things other than just their race. So we know that we are not the only ones thinking about this. We know that there are lots of folks that are trying to dig into this conversation. And so we wanted to continue it with some folks who think about it all day long. You can find the results of our poll and our focus groups online, but we wanted to bring others into the conversation who might be able to add, and I'm very excited to watch this conversation today to talk about this important issue going into 2020. So we have some of the best in the business here today, starting with Jamal Simmons, who is going to be kind of our host and moderator throughout this event. He's one of my favorite people to watch interview people. And he is a 25-year veteran of Democratic campaigns, helped get the last two, I rounded a little down, helped get the last two Democratic presidents elected, knows a lot about this, and is one of those few kind of wise voices on CNN, MSNBC, CBS, all the talking heads that we see. He is now hosted at Hill TV, and he will be guiding today's conversation. We also have Margie O'Maro, principal at GBAO, and she did our research as well as a lot of other research on the complexities of what Black Americans and Americans across the racial spectrum think and how they are thinking about 2020. We have Ted Johnson with us today, who's a senior fellow at the Brennan Center, and he writes and thinks about this topic constantly and understands how the poll we did and others have done really interact with the academic research around what Black Americans think and how they're experiencing politics today. And we have Akuna Cook, who is a principal at Drake Road Strategies and also a new senior fellow at Third Way, who can help us continue to have this conversation over the coming months and years. And we also have Jessica Fulton, who has been our fantastic partner, who is a VP at the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, and also thinks all day long about how to advance Black Americans in today's economy and really understand them in our politics. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jamal.
Thank you. All right, so is this thing on? You guys hear me? Okay, it's great to be here with you all this morning. I've done a couple of these things with Third Way, and I always enjoy it because I find that the conversation gets to be pretty nuanced and robust. We kind of get out of just the big talking points that people get into very often when they have these conversations, and really try to talk about how Americans are thinking about these things who are not sitting in Washington, D.C. at 8:30 in the morning having policy conversations, like most of the people that I grew up with and where I grew up in Detroit. So this is exciting for me. So we're going to start here, and we're going to start with Margie. And Margie, I was going to ask you a question that I decided not to, because I thought I would be the only person that would get the joke. which is what do black people want? But but I will ask you, in the research that you guys did, what did you find, and how did you pull this together in a way that you think is compelling for this audience?
Yeah, well, first, thanks to Third Way and Lene, and also to Joint Center, and also for all the work that's actually been happening on the left over the past year or two. We've been part of a wide range of projects, deep dive on Latinx voters, another project that we worked on where we studied Latinx and African Americans. We did some work on Get Out the Census that we translated into 5 languages. We've done dozens of focus groups in the South on race, which I'll talk about a little bit for the Unum Fund. So I think there has been some improvement, or perhaps a dedication now on the left to making sure these are not just 100 interview crosstab bullet points, but something that does really a deep dive that's both qualitative and quantitative. So what we did, the combination of talking to folks in person, going to 3 different markets. Jarrell Williams, my colleague here, moderated groups around the country, and really listening to what people had to say about what their issues, what was top of mind for them, and making sure our survey really reflected what people wanted to talk about and what we heard. And so, for example, we heard a lot of people talk about gentrification. That wasn't, on our list of questions, but it came up in every single group where it said, what's going on in your community, what's going on in your neighborhood, and that was a conversation that people really quickly wanted to go to. And so that's something then we adapted in our survey to make sure we were exploring that and seeing the level of, familiarity with the word. Did people have a positive or negative response to the word? How do they feel their community is in, their benefits or perhaps negative impacts of community change, which you can see in the survey that folks have at their piece of paper, at their seats. But we found, for example, that in urban areas where people were more familiar with that phrase, they were more likely to think it had a negative impact on their community. And folks who lived in more rural areas, they were less likely to, feel that had a negative impact because they weren't really as familiar with, that wasn't something that impacted them. In focus groups, you're right near a city and people, that was top of mind. So that was, one thing that we were trying to make sure we adapted. I mean, the other thing, and this is true, across all this work, which is, African Americans aren't monolithic. They aren't monolithic demographically. They aren't monolithic in the issues that they care about. They aren't monolithic in their, their experiences. Even the phrase, calling African Americans urban, which is obviously a shorthand that you've seen a lot, is not even majority of African Americans in the survey would describe themselves as living in an urban area. So even that, just beginning there, never mind when you get to things like party or ideology and so on. The other thing is, this is an audience, a group that's really engaged in the election. They're self-reporting that they're going to vote, that this election is going to impact them personally more than previous ones, that they want to be contacted and reached out to and spoken to by elected officials the same way voters across the country of all kinds of other backgrounds do. They want people to come to their community and talk about the issues they care about. There isn't some, people don't volunteer some special secret way to talk to African Americans. They want to be, spoken to with and addressed with, open ears and understanding and commitment and fighting for the for all the voters they represent. Just like, we all want the same things. I guess the answer to that question is, at some level, people want a lot of the same things. I think then the last, thing that we or the last 2 things that we found is, one is the importance of a lot of economic issues, whether it's the cost of living, whether it's healthcare, education, that these housing, that these issues are really top of mind. That in terms of what would make people's lives better, what they see as a role for government, what would improve their own personal situation, and some variation. Not to say these issues weren't important, but some variation when it comes to issues like criminal justice reform or vote suppression, that while part of the news coverage of issues that African Americans care about, which for sure they do, is not always as high as some of these economic issues. And you heard it in the focus groups quite keenly, where in Atlanta, vote suppression had a very, very clear definition In Philadelphia, it was, most people voted for Hillary Clinton, but Hillary Clinton didn't win. That's a different definition than what people said in Atlanta, which is they took this machine and then they said that machine was broken, and then in this place, this voting precinct. And so they had very, very clear, obviously, recent experience with a very clear definition of vote suppression that was completely different from what you heard in other markets. And I think that's that was an important finding that I think was borne out by the data. So I'll stop there because I think that's probably enough for the intro. But anyway, but thanks for that.
No, it's good. I like when you're talking about the location. People who do electoral work now are grappling with something that is not often discussed, which is finding a lot of African American voters means to going to precincts that are not majority African American very often. And so you think, oh, you have to go to, I'm from Detroit, you have to go to Detroit to go talk to the black voters. Well, there's a big concentration of black voters there, but if you go to Oakland County and you go to Macomb, there's all these people who are sprinkled around, and so you have to be a little bit more creative than you had to before. Jessica, I know you guys at Joint Center, this is what you guys do every single day, is think about the issues that are impacting African Americans, how to translate them, both translate them to the people who are who are listening to you, who are in the communities, but also translate them to the broader American population. What did you get from the research that you think was important?
Yeah, so am I on? At the Joint Center, we care a lot about listening to Black communities, and so we kind of jumped at the opportunity to partner on another project where we could get to hear from the voices of folks across the country, Black folks across the country. And listening to the focus groups in particular, I was really struck by the fact that these conversations that were happening were not unfamiliar to me, right? These are conversations that folks in my family have, that I might hear if I go, hang out with my friends. And it really, it actually brought to light kind of the importance of folks having more diverse staffs, that these campaigns should be hiring Black folks and should be listening to them. They should be, and this is something that I think would be clear across communities. And so that was something that really, really struck me. This is not foreign information. This is something that people can get pretty easily if they hire the kinds of folks that are from these communities that can kind of help to inform their campaigns and their priorities.
Akuna, one of the aspects of this, when you look at the demographic information, is around employment. And you see, was it 58% of people are employed, 14% retired. There's a chunk of folks who are self-employed, people work for government, but most people work for the private sector, which is also not something that you think about when you're thinking about African Americans. And so how are you, when you think about the economics of the people in these communities, what is it that jumps out to you?
Yeah, that's a super great point, and one of the things that did jump out to me looking at where people work from the Black community. I don't think it's surprising that when you ask Black folks about their views on the economy, that they tend to have a range of that there's not a monolith, because so many people, there are people who work for companies, for private companies. Only about 12% own businesses, although 30% would like to start a business within the next 5 years. But I think that this relationship between companies, the private sector, and what the role for the government is and what the role for workers is very important. It's a conversation that we need to be having around what does it mean to have a job. A lot of the folks in the survey reported that their concern is having access to good jobs, but also getting enough, getting paid in their job so that they only have to have one job as opposed to multiple. A lot of people reported having to have 2 or 3 jobs just to be able to, cover their living expenses. And so I think that the conversation around how do we work with the private sector to make these opportunities available broadly, and how do we work with the Black community to improve the relationships between the private sector organizations and others that are employers in their communities? How do we do that in a way that will be sustainable so that people feel like they have an equal opportunity? I think that that's a hugely important issue. Many elections people say it's about jobs, 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 and I think this one, that's certainly going to be a part of the narrative.
Ted, we're having a conversation nationally in the Democratic Party as we watch this debate, as we watch this primary go through, that seems to have a lot of ideology in it, and a lot of people who are taking perspectives from, are you in the progressive lane? Are you in the moderate lane? Are you in the, anti-establishment or whatever? Like, everyone's trying to classify this. But when I think about a lot of the African Americans I know, and when age really comes into play, the word that comes to me every single day that is like the blaring blueprint or the blaring billboard is pragmatism, right? That I find African American voters, particularly the older they get, are among the most pragmatic people that you will find in American politics.
Right.
Is that something that rings true to you?
Without a doubt, without a doubt. So here's the issue. Every 4 years when there's a presidential election, it's a foregone conclusion that black folks are going to vote for the Democratic candidate. Everyone takes that for granted. And then you've heard us say, and you will hear people say in the press all the time, that black folks are not a monolith. And these two things feel like they're in tension. This group is not a monolith, but 90% or more are going to vote for whoever the Democratic nominee is. How does that exist? And so the issue is that party often mutes the political diversity within black America. And so while black Americans hold tons of ideological views from the very conservative to the very liberal, when the election comes, it is essentially a single issue referenda on civil rights. Because I would love to tell you what I think about taxes and energy and healthcare, but if you won't let me vote, if you're going to imprison me and my kids, if I'm not going to get a fair shot in America, everything else is secondary to racial equality and the protection of civil rights gains to date and the hope for more. So pragmatism is essentially the idea that you support the candidate that is most likely to win. And in this case, in the case of Black America, it is the Democratic nominee, the Democratic candidate, who can become the nominee that is most likely to beat the Republican candidate or incumbent, in the hopes that the removal of the Republican president will put a Democratic president in who will recognize the value of the black vote and thereby at least protect, if not improve, the civil rights gains today. Now, this feels like black folks are suppressing their true urges in order to compromise on what they really want from government and put a white man or the pragmatic black respectable guy into office. And in some respects, that's true. When you have the history that Black America has, you don't have the luxury of using your vote as an ideological as a voice for what you really, really want out of government. You have to use your voice in a way that respects the hard-earned fight that allowed the vote to come to your right to vote to come to be, and give you and your people the best chance at putting someone into office who's going to at least protect the civil rights gains today.
Well, I've got a real life case study that I think illuminates that. One is Barack Obama is a state senator in Illinois. He decides to run for Congress from Chicago. And he gets his ass kicked, right? He decides to run for the United States Senate, and he gets overwhelming support from the same people who a couple of years earlier chose not to send him to Congress. I think the closer you are when African Americans think that they have a control over the seat and they can pick the person that is going to be the voice they want, the loudest on the things that they care about, they will choose somebody very different than when they start thinking about, okay, of the people who are here, who's the person that most aligns with me, frankly, that white people will vote for also, right?
So in 2008, that was the case. Barack Obama was doing okay with black voters, but Hillary Clinton was doing much better. And as soon as Barack Obama wins Iowa, suddenly the black vote nationally, certainly in South Carolina and the states that followed, swung heavily towards him. Because he proved that, one, he could win over white folks, which means he's now electable. He also proved that his campaign was viable. And so now you could dare to dream by supporting a black candidate because there's an actual path. Jesse or Al Sharpton had run before, Carol Moseley Braun had run before. Black folks just don't vote for the black candidate.
Right.
You know, you have to prove.
Cory Booker and Kamala
Cory
Harris.
Booker and Kamala Harris, exactly. That's right. So it's not enough to be black, and this is also one of the myths that circle the electorate, that just put the black person forward, they'll mobilize people, and it just doesn't work that way. You have to prove viability, electability, and then you've got a shot at winning black voters because of that pragmatism.
All right, Margie, when you guys did your research, you talked about this a little bit when you first started, but let's get back to the question of priorities. And so as people are thinking not necessarily just about who's going to be my champion in the general election, but the things that I care about, what were the priorities that you saw that people said they were most concerned about in this particular political environment?
So, I mean, the issues of, housing and cost of living, healthcare, education were really salient. And then in other work that we did, and that was work with the Joint Center and other partners, we had a different kind of way of asking about it, like which of these things are challenges or have been obstacles for you? And then a separate series, like which of the, how big of a role should the federal government have in these? And there we saw something I think was pretty illustrative, particularly on healthcare, which is healthcare maybe was not necessarily always everybody's top obstacle. They might have had something else, but it was seen as very much a role for the federal government. That was one of the bigger differences between those two rankings, which I think is, an interesting point just in terms of how we talk about healthcare. It doesn't always have to be something that's happening to you right that moment for you to think that that's important for the government to get involved in. And I do want to talk a little bit about how people view, we didn't do a lot of like voting issues or how you were going to vote or candidate work in this, but we did ask about Trump and about race more broadly, which is obviously on a lot of people's minds. And it was, so there were a few things that I think are important. First is, how do people talk about Trump? Do they even come to the table wanting to talk about how they feel about Trump? And that varied. For the most part, not everybody wants to kind of have that Trump conversation. This is true in every focus group. Once Trump is mentioned, the energy in the group sort of changes, So that was true in these groups too. And we wanted to get at this question that I think, is important. It's probably not a surprise to folks in this room, but it was still interesting to hear people both in the qualitative and the quantitative, which is, do you feel that there's more racial tension now because of Trump, or has he just, encouraged people to act and be open about views that they've always had? And in the focus groups and in the survey, it was like very, it was the latter. Like, this is, Trump is allowed, this is nothing new. This is just now more out in the open. We've always known this. Now everybody else knows this now too. And with one person saying, it's like the summer in Florida. It's always hot in Florida, but in the summer you notice it a little bit more. And that's how they felt about Trump and racism. It's always there, but now under Trump you just feel you're just a little bit more aware of it. So that's something that really was a common response that we heard a lot. And while I mentioned before that some issues that people often think of as issues that the African American community cares about, in particular, like criminal justice reform, vote suppression, and so on, were a little bit lower relative to some of the economic issues. Racism and discrimination was high. It was top tier with all the economic issues. And so that was something that really permeated, all of the groups. It was a lens through people view how they view the economy, how they view government.
I guess to Ted's point about civil rights being a single issue in each election.
Yep. And so, when you do these groups, you immediately enter that conversation, or do you wait for people to bring it up, or do you give people kind of a question to kind of say, all right, now we're going to talk about race. What are people's thoughts? You didn't need to do that. You don't really need to do it in white groups of white voters either, to be honest, but you didn't need to do it in these groups. So it's, it's something that is top of mind for a lot of people.
So Jessica, we talked about pragmatism for a bunch of the people on in the electorate who don't seem to share the same pragmatism are younger African American voters, and probably for good reason, because they're thinking more about the future than they are about what's happening right now. They got a longer time horizon about what it is they want. What in the work that you've seen, how do you see these issues playing out about beating Trump and finding a pragmatic candidate versus really espousing the aspirations of a generation?
So one of the things that was really concerning to me throughout the groups was when people talked about how they felt about this time in our country, like people are afraid and people are kind of looking for something, looking for situations to improve. There was one of the questions that we asked was, you know, are you feeling better or worse about the economy right now in comparison to 2 years ago? And people largely felt like they were either doing the same or doing worse, right? Just 1 in 5 people felt like things were getting better. And I think that, you know, being a millennial and coming out of the recession, graduating into the recession, like I can definitely understand a feeling of wanting to try something different and feeling like the pragmatism, it hasn't worked for keeping us whole or safe so far. And so like, how do we kind of shift and think about what to focus on next? I think the questions about the economy were particularly salient considering how much we are talking about how Black unemployment is at historic lows, and like the study shows that doesn't really mean that much for people's lives, for people's lived experiences. And even when we talked about the criminal justice issues in the focus groups, people talked about that in terms of like, well, this means that my son is not able to get a job or my husband isn't able to get a job, right? Like these issues all come back around. They're all tied back to these jobs issues that Acuna was talking about. And so I think, you know, that's kind of where people are frustrated and they're looking for something different right now.
So I'm going to stay with you for a second because let's get to the next group of voters that everybody seems to be more willing to recognize now that drive the Democratic electorate, which are African-American women. Mm-hmm. And did you see anything in the qualitative or quantitative from African-American women that really was a highlight for you?
Yeah, I was really excited about how engaged, I mean, it's not a surprise, right? But how engaged Black women voters were and how everyone was talking about what they wanted to do to get out the vote as a next step, right? Like, so I'm going to talk to my neighbors, I'm going to talk to my friends, I'm going to donate, I'm going to post on social media, right? People are thinking about how they can really help to get folks out to vote. People talked about voting with such reverence. It was really wonderful. And I think that, you know, one of the things we were talking about earlier, we need candidates that are going to motivate folks to get out. We can't depend on people to dislike the candidate on the opposing side. That may not be enough to kind of push past the barriers that Margie talked about earlier in getting out the vote.
So Jessica, Kuna and Jessica mentioned, we talked about African-American women, in general African-Americans doing worse, feeling with they're either the same or doing worse in this environment. African-American women are, I think, 11 points more likely to say they're doing worse than men. What do you think is driving that?
Well, I think, well, first I just want to go back to the question around pragmatism.
Yeah.
And just make this point that I think the reason you see this level of pragmatism in the Black community is, you know, you have to consider some of the history. And there's always this context of what is realistic given what's happening in America. Like, what will, in other words, what is realistic for what white people will allow, right?
Exactly.
And so,
white people get upset,
right,
Black
like
people get hurt.
Exactly. And this point really came, you know, it really crystallized for me in some focus groups that I did a couple of months ago, looking at Black American views on reparations. And I think when we did a poll and it came out and there wasn't a whole lot of support for reparations because Black people don't feel like it's realistic. They don't feel like it's achievable, right? And so there's not going to be a ton of energy being put behind something that you don't see as achievable. So I think sometimes when we talk about these policy areas, we need to keep in mind that when we're talking to Black, you know, the Black community, there's a context, you know, a lived context and a lived experience that they see, like, is this candidate really viable? Are these policy areas really achievable? So I think when we talk about pragmatism, we should keep that in mind. In terms of the way that Black women are doing in the economy, I think it's actually comparable to what you see. You know, we have racism at work, but we also have gender discrimination at work. And so it's not dissimilar to what the wage gap is, the gender wage gap overall. But what I do think is really interesting and is an opportunity for engaging Black women in particular is we are the fastest growing group of entrepreneurs in this country, right? The issues around access to capital and access to jobs is one that Black women are really passionate around. And so that is always going to be an area where, when you talk about these kitchen table issues with jobs, whether it's wages, which came up a lot in the survey, that's going to resonate with Black women. And we know that Black women do a ton of the work for the party in terms of getting out the vote, et cetera. And so that's an opportunity to engage for sure.
All right, so Ted, we got to talk about the bras. So one of the pollsters who I like and listen to is very concerned that Donald Trump is making a play for African American men, and that there is some reception to the appeal that he's making to African American men. Do you think that that is something that? Do you think that that's real?
So kinda.
This might be like from 6 points to 7 points.
Exactly. So that's the thing, right? It is true that in 2016, Donald Trump got 13% of Black men to support him. Only 4% of Black women supported him. There is always a gap between Black women and Black men on the partisan scale, but for Black men to be triple the share of Black women is not normal. So there is something about Trump's appeal. He presents as a self-made man. He's a bit of a womanizer. He's sort of like he's able to say whatever he wants to say without paying a penalty. And there's something in masculinity, period, that sort of likes being self-made, that likes being attractive, and that likes to be able to express yourself without penalty. And so there's that. But frankly,
getting FU money, right? Like that's what people ultimately are in the game for. Right?
Here's the thing, though. Trump actually hasn't. He has underperformed every other Republican president since 1968 that didn't run against a Black guy. So he did get 8% of the Black vote, 13% of Black men, 4% of Black women. But the average Republican person running for president, whether they're incumbent or a candidate, has gotten about 10 or 11% from 68 until 2004. 2008, Romney and McCain have a different challenge. And so the Republican Party says, well, Donald Trump did better than Romney and McCain with Black voters, which is true because he was running against Hillary Clinton, not Barack Obama, but he underperformed every Republican that had run, previous to that. So he's making a play for Black men on this sort of, with his theatric masculinity and this sort of, and I think they're.
Well, look, let's do the policy thing here. There's a criminal justice play, the First Step Act.
Right.
The high-profile dealings with Kanye and Kim around getting people out of jail. The ASAP Rocky that he's helping, in Europe. Like he's doing these big flamboyant things that get attention. That my HBCU money that he makes a big deal out of, right? These big things that get attention, but maybe there's a bunch of stuff underneath that people should pay more attention.
I don't know. So the policy, those positions aren't going to move Black voters. I think they're almost to help white voters who support him say, how could he be racist if look what he's done for Black unemployment. Look what he did with the First Step Act. Look, Tim Scott is the reason the HBCU money is flowing through this administration, and Trump is just the signee. So here's the issue is that one, within Black America, especially Black men, there's this strain of self-determination and individualism that's been around forever. I mean, this is what Booker T. Washington was espousing a century ago. So there's some of that appeal, but Trump's real goal, in my view, and I have no inside knowledge here, is that if you keep Black men home, then for every 10 Black people you keep home, every 10 Black men you keep home, that's 9 votes that aren't going to the Democrat and only 1 vote that's not coming to him. And so you don't have to win the voter over. You just have to convince the voter, the Black man in this case, that things are not going to get better under whoever the Democratic nominee put forward, and at least I've done something for you. So this is another election you should consider sitting out. And by making these appeals, it's the energy and time and resource it takes to win them over is not what they're willing to expend, but just these symbolic gestures coupled with maybe painting the Democratic candidate in a bad light would be enough to keep Black men home. That would help him win the election if it's on the margins again.
Jessica, I see you down there furiously taking notes. I want to know if you want to get in on this, or is that for something else?
I was just writing that down. I thought that was a really important point, and I think it's something that folks really
candidates generally really need to think about is how they're motivating folks and encouraging to come out, how they're making it worth it.
This is a
I mean,
mobilization election.
Michigan, there is an African American man running on the Republican side for Senate. Like that is, however true this pattern may be, and I thought that was a very astute observation. In Michigan, in particular, it could be crucially important given that it's the battleground state and has a battleground Senate race.
Yeah, John James in Michigan
Right.
did better with black men than the governor did, and so it's 2 or 3%. But 77,000 votes decided 2016.
All right, he's going to be doing joint appearances with James,
Right.
close to the election that will get televised around the country. So, I mean, I think that's even if James is not successful in Michigan, it could still play a role, in sort of in his news coverage.
Yeah, black men are more politically disengaged than black women, and that's and I think Trump is the Republican Party leverages that fact.
But in the focus groups, we did not. Again, we didn't go too deep into Trump, but we did not, hear people. We didn't hear men in particular volunteer unaided, admiration for Trump in
Right.
particular. We did hear, though, pretty gendered differences in kind of the worries, worries about what the struggles that are unique to African American men. We heard it from African American men, and we heard it from the women about African American men, about the challenges that they face and the talks they have with their sons. So that was something that was very unique. Both sets of groups specifically addressing the needs of African American men.
Akuna, let's talk about education for a second. There's two sides to this coin. One is there's a lot more educated African Americans than I think people give credit for. The number I saw from the research was 37% of African Americans have some post-high school education, 22% have 4-year degrees. And then, so people don't think about the fact that 59%, almost 60% of African Americans have some post-high school education. But there's also this concern about what happens with education and investing in education. One topic, I was looking at it out here, even on some of these panels, is this conversation around charter schools. Is that still happening in the African American community as a driver of election, or have people sort of pulled away from charter schools as an interest, even though African Americans were a huge focus of the charter school movement?
Well, just so starting with the sort of introduction of your question, which is that African Americans are, in fact, we've always prioritized education in the Black community. That's always been, an aspiration and a value in the Black community. I think where the disconnect sometimes is that once you do have your college degree, and once you do, go out into the workforce, we know that the statistics are that even having a college degree, your income is likely to be around the same as a white person who has a high school degree, right? So there is that disconnect of, okay, I have worked hard and I have done the things, checked the boxes that I was supposed to, and I'm maybe not seeing the outcomes that I should get. So I think we should always just be cognizant of that when we talk about what higher education means in the Black community and how that relates to employment. On the issue of charter schools, I think, again, education is something that we very much value in the Black community. We know that it was a factor in the Gillum race, which a lot of people did not really appreciate. Andrew Gillum in Florida, yeah. So in the Florida gubernatorial race in 2018, there was actually a suppression of the Black vote, some folks who actually voted for DeSantis, a higher number, over the issue of charter schools. Nationally, and how that will play it in 2020, I don't think that it will have the same kind of resonance because those tend to be local issues, and I don't see this election really getting down to the specifics around charter schools. But I think generally education, and particularly access to college and college affordability, very much are going to be, the fact there are some of these candidates that are doing way better than we think they should be is because of their positions on student loans. And I think we really need to be real. That affects Black women, actually. We're the ones that are most affected because we tend to be have higher rates of completing college and therefore have higher rates of student loan debt. And so the popularity of Sanders and Warren around what they want to do around student loans, like, that's real. And so we should be thinking about what does higher education and what the cost of it and access to it, because those are issues that are actually driving a lot of the conversation in this race.
All right, I want to open this up to questions from the audience so we can have a little conversation if people want to get in. Anybody here, sir? Do we have a microphone, or just stand up and talk? And please say your name, if you have an affiliation you want to tell us, and a very short question that ends with a question mark.
Sure. My name's Carl Polzer, and I started a project called the Center on Capital and Social Equity 5 years ago. So I look at inequality analytically, but then I try to advocate for the bottom half. And when you advocate for the bottom half, you get the Trump people, you get the Black people, you get all these different kinds of people. So my question is a little bit nuanced, and I want to be open-minded. I'm frustrated with the Democratic left and how they try to capture the Black vote. And maybe this is an inside the Beltway perspective, but most of the meetings you go to when they talk about poverty is always a Black person. Yes, they have more poverty. Yes, they're worse off. But I think what this does, it really cripples the Democrats' ability to get Trump voters back, because there's a growing underclass in the United States that includes a lot of white people. And so I think it would be better for the Democratic Party to feature both types and try to unify them in some kind of if you want your economic pragmatism to happen. My question is, if you want to be pragmatic about economic issues, wouldn't you want to kind of form an alliance or try to get some of the Trump voters back? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, and so the numbers are that there are more white people in poverty in the United States than Black people, but the rate of poverty within Black America is higher than it is in white America. There are more white Americans on SNAP, on you name the program, but the rate is disproportionate. So what I'll say is, yes, there should be a working class message. But there needs also to be a raced version of the working class message. So I think it's okay to talk about poverty to Black audiences, because in poverty, even there is disparity among the poor. For every dollar a poor white person has, a poor Black person has a nickel. So poverty isn't just poverty. There is a Black kind of poverty and a white kind of poverty. And the mobility out of that poverty is better for the white Americans living in poverty than it is for Black Americans. So I think there is a standard message of uplifting the working class and helping people escape poverty. But I do think there needs to be special messages to different audiences. You can't talk about poverty in Silicon Valley the same way you would talk about it in Columbus, Ohio. It's just two different regions. Similarly, you can't talk about poverty with Black audiences in the exact same way you talk about poverty with white audiences.
Can also add that there's a racial element there too. I mean, this trying to break up the coalition of poor and Black, poor whites and Blacks is it goes back to history. I mean, goes back to hundreds of years, right? And so I don't want to say responsibility, but I do think that there needs to just be an awareness that when you're talking to poor Blacks and you're talking to poor whites, that race is always going to be a wedge there, used as a wedge to separate those two groups. And so, yes, you make a valid point. Poor whites who may be, inclined to vote for Trump versus poor Blacks who end up, supporting the Democrat. It's race that's really separating these two groups, and we need to be aware of that and speak to that, which goes back to what we found in the survey, that this is a highly racialized climate that we're working in.
I'll just give you one anecdote. The beginning of the founding of the United Auto Workers, originally the UAW did not allow African Americans to join the UAW. And what happened was the UAW would go on strike, and Henry Ford would go out and recruit Black workers to come fill the jobs for the white strikers. So the UAW was forced to include African Americans to hold the strikes. So I'm not sure that it's Black workers who are the ones who are resistant to a cross-cultural coalition around.
Exactly.
Okay.
mostly directed at the left leaders.
Right.
Not you guys. You guys
Right,
have
yeah.
had the greatest conversation I've heard in a long time.
Very good.
I mean, I was struck in the focus groups that quite a few people said, well, you know, white people are having it hard right now, too. And that's not something I often hear in white groups of like Republican-leaning non-college white groups. Like, I don't often hear them, you know, just sort of have a eureka moment like that. But it was, you know, unaided, but it was something that we heard, you know, in quite a few of the focus groups.
May I ask a question? Over here. Hi. You got a microphone coming to you, your name and any affiliation?
Hi, Maura Keefe. I'm with Keefe Strategies, doing some work with Third Way. I'm really interested to understand if you heard in some of these focus groups in your polling, a sense that this president is trying to erase Barack Obama's presidency at all. Again, we see today another instance of him rolling back waters of the U.S., and there seems to be, at least conversationally, that there's a list, and it's just he's going down it to sort of erase the Obama legacy. And did you hear any of that? Did that come up at all?
You know, we didn't ask about it in these groups. It didn't really come up. I mean, we have some work, but this is a national poll that shows that, you know, trying to kind of have a conversation about Trump saying, well, he's trying to just, you know, go back against what, you know, he's trying to erase what Obama did. Something similar to what you said. I don't have a full wording. That doesn't work as well as just talking about Trump and his record. That seems just like as a partisan back and forth. Now, it may be different with the African American community, but overall, it's just seen as like a partisan back and forth. But that may be different, you know, in different communities.
Yeah.
My name's Richard Goodstein. I'm a consultant. In 2008, I was a poll watcher for Obama in an entirely black precinct in Fort Lauderdale. Huge lines, hours-long lines. And the last day of early voting, a young guy, clearly a first-time voter who was hours from getting in the door, motioned me over, and he said, "Can I just vote for Barack?" I said, "Well, you can, but Alcee Hastings..." I mean, I started, and he stopped me. He said, "Well, if I can, why don't they have an express line for people like me?" And I think he was only being slightly facetious, because if they had, he would have used it in a heartbeat. And I'm convinced that guy didn't show up for Hillary, that the 2016 version of him just didn't care. My question is, what do you believe that if there's a black person as a VP candidate for whoever the Democratic nominee is, whether that will mobilize that guy or not?
Yeah, that's a great question. We were actually talking about this just before the start here. So there are two things here. One is if the Democratic Party believes that anger at Donald Trump is going to mobilize black voters, they're wrong. There's a great new book out called The Anger Gap by Professor Dabin Phoenix that shows black anger is processed differently electorally than white anger is. So it's not enough to be mad at Trump. The other truth is in 2012, black turnout was 66.6%. 2016, black turnout was 59.6%. Now, Hillary Clinton was never going to get Barack Obama's turnout, but a 7-point drop-off is large. So the two things together means that if you don't mobilize black voters, you're not going to win elections. And two, if you expect anger at Trump to be that mobilization factor, you're not going to win an election. So the question is, and to your question here is, will a black vice presidential candidate help mobilize black voters, no matter who is at the top of the ticket, to the point where it raises turnout and helps the Democratic nominee win? And we'll see. I think the answer is yes. I think if you were to put a black female candidate in particular as the VP, and she engages black voters, what the research has also shown is that if there's anger and a true grassroots outreach effort, that mobilizes black voters. And to the earlier points, there is no better mobilizer of black voters than black women. And so the right black female vice presidential candidate, I think, could have an outsized impact on the election in a way that traditionally isn't true for vice presidential candidates. They don't lend regional advantages, home state advantages, and we've seen 2 women run as VP candidates, and Mondale and Ferraro did not win women voters. And Palin and McCain. Palin actually did not help McCain win over women voters or white women voters, for that matter. So, but I do think because of black voting behavior, I think it's different, and I think a black female VP may have that effect. Now, that doesn't help the young man get in the express line. We know that voting times in black districts, there was a recent study that we looked at the Brennan Center that looked at people's cell phone locations, and locations in black districts, people's cell phones were in that location for longer times on election day than in other places, which indicates that they were waiting in line 3 to 4 times longer than in places that were majority white. And that was just, I think, around in Georgia. So he's going to have to wait, but he may wait for a ticket that has a black woman on it.
And that doesn't include the places where they changed the voting location in the last week.
Or they close it because it's not, they say it's not handicap accessible, you know.
Right.
Yeah.
But Jessica, I want to put a little fly in this ointment a little bit, particularly around young progressive voters, because the conversation that I hear among many young progressive voters is that won't be enough if somebody like, let's say, Joe Biden is at the top of the Democratic ticket. Black alone won't be enough.
So I'm thinking about how to answer this question with
So I'm
my
wondering
C3
if you
hat. I think that young black women voters are particularly engaged in this election and are particularly engaged in working with candidates who are willing to kind of listen to them and work with them and understand what their priorities are. A lot of the conversations that I've been hearing, people are very clear about the vision that they want for this country, and they are very clear about which candidates are maybe not in line with that. And I think that's something that folks need to take note of, because like these folks are working. They are putting in the hours. They are knocking on doors. They are already kind of mobilizing and engaging folks. And I think that's something that everybody needs to be mindful of.
I think you saved your tax status. Yes, in the front here. Oh, I'm sorry. This gentleman had the run. Okay. Let's go with here, and then we'll come back.
I'm Abigail Woodward, and I've worked in politics in Georgia and North Carolina. North Carolina specifically, I'd like to ask if you guys have any information on views on the census and redistricting.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, North Carolina is, ground zero for every democratic issue that we have in this country, and particularly redistricting. So, Roy Cooper's up for re-election this year, and it's going to be hugely important for redistricting. We saw in 2018, I think there were several elections that didn't, that continued because of redistricting challenges, and that's going to continue. So I would say North Carolina is probably one of the most important states, not only because it's, basically still a battleground state in my view, but also the, just whatever precedents are going to be set there from a judicial point of view with what happens with these maps and how that gets resolved, but also the conversation that voters there are going to be having, and the outcomes of their elections are going to have huge consequences for a while. So both census, this year's census, redistricting, the two elections, both the primary and the general, I mean, they're huge, ramifications for at least the next 10 years.
Margie, I want you to talk about this because you're a pollster, and this data is like the gold mine of polling, right?
Yeah, I mean, if we just polled pollsters, the census would be like one of the top 3 issues on people's minds. But, so we haven't done the focus groups where we asked about the census, and it doesn't come up unaided. But in our survey work on the census, and that was for a different effort, and this was across all the different audiences that we spoke to, a message that was seemingly political in nature didn't work as well as one that was simply about it's, you need to be counted, right? You should be counted. So, and that makes sense. Like something a little bit more political is going to have a sharper edge that some people may drop off. But in a different project where we were talking about democracy and democratic reforms, and not necessarily redistricting, but other kinds of issues, African Americans in the focus groups were a lot more engaged on these topics than a lot of the other audiences we spoke to. And, there were some audiences we spoke to really had no idea what we were talking about. And African Americans, particularly in the South, came to the table, wanted to talk about felon rights and wanted to talk about, vote suppression, as I mentioned earlier, wanted to talk, had an awareness of the Electoral College and what that meant. Like, there was a real clear, noticeable difference. Now, again, that was qualitative, but it was striking across a variety of different groups.
Sir.
Good morning, and really great panel by Third Way today. My name is David Krukoff, and I'm a candidate for delegate in D.C. versus Eleanor Holmes Norton. The panel today seems to me very focused on in a partisan lens. I'm part of the reform community and an independent, and I was wondering, I'm confident that there's been a rise in independence over the past 20 years, and I was wondering if you could speak to some of the individualism I think that you mentioned, and about independence and whether we are seeing more nonpartisans within the African American community.
You saw, was it 57-ish% of people who identified as Democrats? But how do you think that plays out in terms of the choices they make on Election Day?
Yeah, I mean, overall, nationally, there's been a rise in the percent that self-identifies independents and a drop-off of both parties. It's become, like cooler to say you're independent than to say you've picked a side. Like, I'm beyond sides. I have my, my own thoughts, right? And I'm not dismissing that but I want to note though that among independents, most of them actually do pick a side. There is a very small group that is pure independent. More independents are actually, they lean Democrat or they have a variety of progressive views. There are lots of Republican-leaning independents. So while the label has diminished a little bit in its power and certainly attachment to the brand of each party, and whether the parties themselves have power and meaning and social, provide a social value, that I think is also part of it. And how we pick candidates, et cetera. But the independent piece, there's still, there is a core group. That piece has not grown as much. Who are just pure independent who don't identify with either party. Both Pew and Gallup show something similar. I mean, the Pew Typology, and we actually, which I didn't even talk about, we have a couple of the Pew Typology questions in our survey. So Gallup shows it, and then Pew digs a little bit deeper. And in the Pew, they have 8 different typologies. And, you can kind of quibble with the questions they use. They use, because they use the same questions over time. And, you're making a decision about which are the things that define typology as opposed to having like 1,000 questions and seeing which matter. But nonetheless, I think the results are not that surprising, which is the most progressive of the 8 are disproportionately college-educated white women. But yet there are 2 majority-minority, as they define it, as they label it, segments of the 4, and that are disproportionately African-American, that are a little bit more conservative ideologically, even if they, tend to lean Democratic in terms of their party. We asked a couple of the questions that had the most division to see what we found, and the one that was particularly striking that is very much a difference between white Democrats is the question of, do you need to believe in God in order to be a moral person? Where among white Democrats that, they don't agree with that. 2/3 of African Americans roughly say that's true. Now, the really big differences, though, within audiences among African Americans, older non-college African American women are going to feel a lot different on this than younger college-educated African Americans. So there's some differences that I think are important there. And then one other last difference, and I know that I've now gone a little bit from your question, but I did want to note it, which is, we've asked, this was in the project, so Jarrell, correct me if I'm restating it incorrectly, is we asked in another project how, is it good for the country to have conversations about race? Are they generally helpful? And white Democrats say, yes, that these are helpful. African Americans a little bit less so. So I thought that was like there's I think a conversation on the left that folks are having that is important. I think how everybody sort of processes that and the value of it obviously varies.
I'll say one quick thing. In Maryland, in the last gubernatorial race, Larry Hogan won almost a third of black voters, running against a black Democratic nominee in Ben Jealous. These were black folks who vote Democratic, but because of Larry Hogan's engagement, education was a big issue in Maryland. He was able to get a third. Now, if a Republican presidential candidate could get a third, that party probably would never lose the White House again.
Right.
So it's not that you have to attract black independents. It's that you have to talk to black people. And black people are not going to blindly vote the party all the time, especially on local and state races. And so there are opportunities for candidates that are not Republican or that are not Democratic to talk to black audiences and win a significant portion of them if they talk to them about the issues and that engagement is consistent, authentic. There's a path forward. It's difficult, but it's worth the investment for those that try it.
This panel is about African Americans, but I think that just to stay on that topic for a second, if you look at what what Rick Scott did in Florida with Latinos is a clinic, I think, for Republicans, and frankly, it's a clinic for Democrats about how to engage the Latino community. And he paid a lot of attention to people and realized that not all Latinos are the same, and talked to people about their individual cultural and country origins, and really engaged very heavily and consistently. And I think engagement and consistency are kind of things that go across the line, right across.
Absolutely.
You had a question.
Fantastic panel. Thank you very much. I have two quick questions. I saw a couple questions in here in the data that reflect that faith in God and that kind of thing. So I just wanted to know, where is the Black church in this conversation? What's their role in 2020? And then I should say that I'm the district director for the current serving Congresswoman of Washington, D.C., Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton. So I'm a Gen Xer, and I have lots of millennials on my team. And I struggle with the pragmatism that my generation has, because they really are pushing us to talk about, like, why aren't we sending like fresh new voices to the floor to kind of do some new things? And so where is the kind of conversation where's the responsibility on my generation to have with the millennials?
Yeah, as another Gen Xer, I got to tell you, I feel this pain all the time. We're sandwiched between these two behemoth generations, and nobody cares about what we think.
I'm going to be a millennial now. I'm just going to keep staying whatever the second youngest is.
But let's talk about the Black church. Margie, you talked about the God preference in terms of morality, but let's talk about the role of the Black church as a political of driving force in the community. Does it still have the same power that it has historically? If not, how has it changed? I'll talk to Jessica to start.
Okay.
I think one of the things that I've been noticing quite a bit, and perhaps the current administration is a motivator, but I am noticing policy conversations happening. I know at the Joint Center we've been contacted to partner with a number of denominations to bring more of a policy lens to conferences that they're having. So people are thinking about, in addition to get out the vote, people are thinking past that, and like, how do we really engage our members? How do we make sure that we're kind of pushing forward the right policy? Because I think on the right, when people say evangelicals, they mean like Southern white evangelicals are pushing Christian values in a particular direction that are not in line with where Black Christians are, and so I think there's something there that is growing. I'm not sure what it's going to mean for 2020, but I do know that that's what we're seeing at the Joint Center.
Yeah, I think the biggest role churches play is as an institution that can mobilize voters and get out. It's like a community center / help group / it's like it's a haven and a source of information. And this has traditionally been the case where if you want to talk to Black folks, you go to the local church, and you don't go there to talk to them necessarily about policy, but the importance of their voice and involvement. And so the church has been a mobilizing institution. It is true that all Americans are becoming less attached to institutions generally. And so the church isn't the one stop you make in a black community anymore. You have to go to the barbershops, the salons, the schools, wherever black people congregate, and there are different places in different cities. You got to go there, where before it was just find the 2 or 3 big churches and move on. On the generational question, I don't have a good answer for you. I think there is, so I'm also a Gen Xer, and I like pragmatism makes sense to me. But remember, like Martin Luther King was 20-something when he got arrested, and so young people have always pushed against the norm. And I think it's valuable because they sort of show us what's possible. And it provides a North Star for us pragmatists who now know which direction to go. And while we may be okay with the incremental steps there, they sort of orient what needs to happen for the future. And so I think there's a conversation while we can let them be far out front, and then we can sort of work the policy machine to go in that direction, even if it doesn't happen as fast as young folks would like it to.
You know, no, go ahead.
I also want to just add here that in many ways the conversation that's happening nationally and in many ways this election is almost a referendum on the same conversation around what will our society be in terms of, are we going to maintain being a democracy? Are we going to continue to be a capitalistic society? Like that's a real conversation that's kind of underlying all of what you see happening in certainly the Democratic primary. And I think for those of us who consider ourselves wedded to the tradition, the traditional values of America, of democracy and capitalism, like we have to recognize that what you see, the agitation that you see from young people and from the left, is that we have not done our jobs of making sure that we are reforming capitalism so that it works well for everybody, right? So a lot of the conversations you see about access to capital in the black community is like, we don't have that same access to capital that everyone else does, but if we did, we would be 100% behind capitalism, right? And so I think that just has to be something that us Gen Xers recognize, and for those of us in policy-making positions and with voices in campaigns, et cetera, that we do need to recognize that capitalism needs to be reformed so that we can keep everybody on the same boat and supporting it.
You know, one other thing about social issues, and so just as a adjacent to the issue of the role of faith, and I think, we saw in the focus groups and the survey and Pew and elsewhere the role of faith in the African American community. That doesn't necessarily mean that African Americans are much farther to the right on social issues than white Democrats on things like abortion, immigration, gay marriage. Those issues didn't come up at all in our focus groups. They were not, big dividers in the survey. And so I think that's, I don't want to say a misconception, but is sometimes a hypothesis you'll hear among folks on the left that we didn't really see borne out in the data.
All right. Well, since your name is partially on the door, I'm gonna let Jim ask. Jim ask the last question, and then we're gonna wrap this puppy up.
Sorry to pull door rank. I want to ask a question about urban blacks and suburban blacks, and to see if you found what differences you found beyond things like gentrification, and is there any data out there about turnout rates among suburban blacks versus urban blacks? And if there is, I think if you want to get white people to go, huh? You tell them that there's more African Americans in the suburbs than the cities. Like, what is the way to get that maximum turnout among suburban African American voters if you were a presidential candidate or a Senate candidate?
I mean, I would say, in the qualitative, we did hear, we heard in every group somebody talk about gentrification, whether they called it that or not. I think we heard, particularly, Atlanta, I think was the place where we heard this the most, a sense of that these suburban areas actually were improving and, overall, that the economy was improving, that there were some, even if they felt left out of the economy writ large, there was a sense that there were some things that were going well locally. And I feel like in the suburban areas, suburban has a little bit more optimism, perhaps, while in, cities, when we've gone to cities, in Philadelphia, or when we've talked to folks, in other groups, talk about the public schools and public schools being left behind, and really dramatic stories about, the air conditioning's not working, and, people, the textbooks are falling apart, there's no heating, these kinds of stories that people have in cities that are really, that are not federal per se or necessarily, but are pretty salient when we talk about the people who live in cities. I mean, as far as the turnout piece, I'm curious what other folks on the panel.
Yeah, I don't know if it's if there's a geographic difference. I think it's more class. And so if you have middle class black folks living in cities, they're probably just as likely to turn out as middle-class black folks living in the suburbs, and similarly for working class and poverty. So I can't speak authoritatively on it. I haven't seen any research that breaks it down by location, only by class and education level. But educated black folks they move to the suburbs. And whereas I think more educated white folks are moving back into the cities, which has been the chase, chasing resources and advantage around.
Well, it's also the gentrification piece, right? Gentrification is moving a lot of black people out of cities into suburbs. And so, and to Ted's point, I don't think that there is certainly nothing that I've seen that will talk about how to mobilize suburban blacks versus blacks in city centers. But I do think that to your point, Jim, most people don't realize that the majority of black people don't live in cities. And so that there has to be the same focus on suburban areas across the board as you do on cities when you're trying to target black voters.
I mean, especially since the suburban areas are more likely to have a competitive house race than some of the cities. So maybe it plays a role that's different from the African American experience in one versus the other, but it's the political experience of living in
I think there's also a question about message. So we were talking about messaging and thinking about working class as a big group to speak to. And what we know from the economics research is that black people at higher incomes are more likely to live among white people with lower incomes. And how do you think about how to talk to a group if you're going into a community? How do you think about how to talk to folks who have very different lived experiences and very different outcomes of those experiences, right? So maybe I've gone to college and I am working and I am earning the same as somebody who has a high school diploma, and our outcomes are very different, but our lives our lives have been different, but we're in the same community.
This gets to a question. She's running for Congress now, so she doesn't do things like this. But Maya Rockeymoore Cummings spends a lot of time on this question of wealth.
Yeah.
And even in my own experience, trying to buy a house 2 years ago and going in to buy a house and bidding against another couple that probably made half the income of my wife and I, but they had more cash assets than we had, mostly because of family. So this is the question where wealth begins to matter as you want to figure out your asset accumulation or your lifestyle. It's not just about the income people have, which allows them to, buy a new car when they feel like it.
That's right. Yeah, and the idea that, get more education and that's wealth building for black folks, it's not, because of the student loan problem and the wage discrepancy. And housing values, well, that's the way we traditionally build wealth, but if you're a black family trying to sell your home, you're not going to get the same value for your home. In fact, folks are less likely to buy it if they know black people live in that home. So it's all the ways to build wealth. It's more difficult for black Americans than it is, even when you follow the path that's been laid out for the American dream.
All right. Well, I wanted to end on the uplifting note about faith, but Jim decided he wanted to go a different direction. But I want to thank everybody else for being here. This is a really great panel discussion. I want to thank Third Way for having us and for doing this, along with the Joint Center, and being part of both of you guys bringing this together and bringing all of us together to have the talk. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot more to come after this. So thank you all for being here.
All right.